They didn't destroy you with fists or fire. No, they used silence, suggestion, and shadows. They turned glances into suspicions, turned your name into a question mark. And the most haunting part, you watched it happen in slow motion. People you trusted stepping back. People you never wronged suddenly uneasy around you. You weren't attacked openly. You were uninvited quietly, misunderstood deliberately, misrepresented with a smile, and still, you said nothing, because part of you believed the truth would rise, that your silence was strength, that your character would speak louder than their gossip. But now you understand they didn't want truth. They wanted control, and to have that, they had to make you the enemy. They needed a villain to hide their own sins. They had to make someone the villain, and you were the perfect choice. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your goodness made their guilt unbearable. In their world, accountability feels like an attack, so instead of facing their own failures, they cast you in the role of the problem. You were too honest, too consistent, too unshaken, and that kind of calm makes unstable people restless. So they crafted a version of you that justified their actions. They needed people to believe you were toxic, unreasonable, manipulative, cold, because it helped them sleep at night. It gave them a reason to walk away without facing the wreckage they left behind. And the truth, they didn't just lie to others. They lied to themselves first. They convinced themselves that your standards were cruelty, that your silence was arrogance, that your self-respect was pride. Also, they wouldn't have to face the simple truth. You were never the problem, they were. But admitting that would have meant confronting every false story they told about themselves. So instead they chose the easy path. They needed a scapegoat, and they chose you, not because you were weak, but because you were strong enough to endure it. They knew you wouldn't retaliate. They knew you wouldn't beg. They knew you'd take the high road. And that made it easier for them to walk away and paint you as the storm, when all you ever did was hold the roof together while they set the fire. They needed a villain so people wouldn't see the damage they caused behind closed doors. So they twisted the narrative, just enough to be believable, just enough to be comfortable, and when people asked questions, they didn't offer facts, just feelings, and feelings are powerful when spoken with conviction. You became the story they told to hide their shame. You became the enemy in a war you never started. But here's what they forgot. Truth has a quiet loyalty. It doesn't scream, it doesn't rush, it doesn't need to prove itself. It just waits, watches, and returns when the lies start to crumble under the weight of their own exaggeration. And they will, because no lie can stand forever. The same people who turned away will begin to see what was hidden. And when they do, they'll realize you were never the villain. You were the cover-up, the shield, the target they used to protect their own image. But you'll still be standing, not bitter, not broken. Just free, because the ones who need to destroy someone to feel innocent were never as clean as they pretended to be. And you were never as guilty as they claimed. They needed a villain, but you were the lesson they refused to learn. You were a threat because you knew too much. They didn't fear your actions. They feared your awareness. You saw too clearly. You noticed the shift in their tone, the lies behind their laughter, the cracks behind their charm. And in a world built on pretending, someone like you was dangerous. You were never loud, but your presence was loud enough. Your silence unsettled them, not because it was cold, but because it was watching, dissecting, seeing what others missed. You weren't fooled by their rehearsed words or practiced kindness. You read the space between their sentences. You picked up what others dropped, and when you began to speak less, they panicked more. Because someone like you, quiet but observant, isn't a spectator. You're a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. They reflect, they reveal, and that's what they couldn't handle. They weren't afraid of you hurting them. They were afraid of you exposing them, without even trying. You held a truth they worked hard to bury, and being around you felt like being seen in full daylight. That's why they twisted things before you could speak. They had to turn you into a problem before people started asking, why did someone like that pull away? Because deep down, they knew the answer would point back to them. You saw their patterns, their manipulation, their tactics dressed in politeness. You saw how they played victim to gain control, how they pretended to misunderstand just to avoid accountability. You saw how they praised loyalty when it served them and discarded it when it demanded honesty. You saw it all, and even worse for them. You remembered every contradiction, every red flag, every word they said that didn't match their actions, and that memory made you a threat. So they had to destroy your credibility before you had the chance to be believed. That's how fragile their kingdom was. They couldn't risk you speaking your truth, because your truth didn't come with bitterness. It came with precision, and nothing scares a manipulator more than someone who doesn't need revenge. Only clarity. You didn't need to shout, you didn't need to prove, you just knew, and that knowledge, the way you carried it quietly, the way you held yourself with calm confidence, was more powerful than any argument. They wanted people around them who questioned themselves, not ones who questioned them. And you were the wrong kind of smart, the wrong kind of calm, the wrong kind of brave. So they flipped the script before you could write it. They framed you before you could speak, not because you did anything, but because you understood everything. You were never their enemy. You were their unsilenced conscience, and that's what made you dangerous. They wanted control over the narrative. They didn't just want to walk away. They wanted to walk away as the victim, and to do that, they had to rewrite the story. They couldn't leave you as you were, honest, loyal, flawed, but sincere. No, that wouldn't suit the narrative they were crafting, so they took control of the pen. They edited reality, rearranged the truth, and began telling a version of the story where they suffered and you inflicted. In their version, your boundaries became cruelty, your silence became arrogance, your distance became betrayal, because to them, controlling the narrative meant controlling the sympathy, the support, the spotlight. They couldn't risk people asking questions or seeing you clearly, so they blurred the image just enough. A sigh here, a subtle complaint there, a pray for me post masked as concern but rooted in manipulation. And slowly the web formed. People believed them not because the story made sense, but because it was repeated often, emotionally, and with just enough brokenness to feel believable. That's how narratives work. They don't need truth. They need emotion, and they played that emotion like a symphony, while you stayed quiet, thinking your integrity would speak for itself. They filled the silence with their version of events. And silence, in the hands of manipulators, becomes their greatest weapon. You thought your truth was enough, but they knew that in the court of public opinion, the first to speak often wins the room. So they made sure they got there first. They painted you in shadows before anyone could see you in light. They controlled the perception before you even realized you were on trial. And when you finally tried to speak, people were already gone. Minds were made, hearts were closed. You were now a character in someone else's story, a role you never auditioned for, but were cast into anyway, and still you stayed composed, because you knew that chasing rumors would only feed them. You knew that defending yourself against fiction only makes the lie feel real, so you chose dignity, but they mistook that dignity for guilt. They used your calm as confirmation that their story was true. That's how desperate they were to be the hero in a story where they were never harmed. They didn't just want to be free from responsibility. They wanted applause for surviving you. But here's what they can't control: time. Time reveals, time peels back the layers of lies. Time exposes motives, and time, quietly and patiently, will show the difference between someone who lived truthfully and someone who lived theatrically. They may have owned the narrative for a season, but stories rooted in deception don't age well. The same voices that cheered for them will one day begin to question, and when they do, your silence will be remembered, not as weakness, but as wisdom. They wanted control over the narrative, but they never had control over the ending. Your presence reminded them of what they failed to be. You didn't have to say a word. Your very presence said everything. The way you carried yourself, the way you stood firm in your values, the way you showed up with consistency, even when it was hard, that unsettled them. Not because you were perfect, but because you tried. You didn't pretend to be flawless, but you never abandoned your integrity to please the room, and that made them uneasy. You see, people who live in fragments are often disturbed by those who live in alignment. Your honesty reminded them of how often they lie to themselves. Your strength exposed their excuses. Your endurance reminded them of everything they gave up on, and instead of rising to meet the standard, they chose to tear the standard down. You became a walking reminder of everything they failed to become, and that kind of reflection is too uncomfortable for fragile egos. They couldn't celebrate you, because celebrating you would mean acknowledging where they've fallen short. It would mean admitting that they could have done better, but didn't, so they took the easier road. They turned admiration into irritation, respect into rivalry, familiarity into rejection. You didn't change, they changed around you. Not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. You became the symbol of every discipline they lacked, every boundary they crossed, every dream they abandoned, and instead of learning from you, they tried to silence you. They mocked what they couldn't match. They ridiculed what they couldn't replicate. Because if they could reduce you to nothing, then they wouldn't have to face how little they've become. That's the tragedy of envy. It doesn't want what you have. It wants to erase what you have so they can feel whole again. They didn't want your success. They just didn't want to be reminded of their failure. And you, just by existing in truth, were that reminder. You didn't force them to feel small. They already felt that way. You just revealed it. You walked into rooms with quiet strength, and they mistook that for arrogance. But deep down, they weren't offended by your confidence. They were offended by their own lack of it. So they chose to misunderstand you. They exaggerated your flaws, minimized your effort, and inflated your mistakes. Anything to shrink your presence enough that it no longer cast a shadow on theirs. But here's the secret. People like that don't hate you. They hate what you reflect. And when you leave, they don't feel peace. They feel emptier than before because the reflection is gone, and they're left with themselves again. You reminded them of what they could have been, if only they had been brave enough to be real, and so they chose to reject the reminder, not because you were unworthy, but because they were unwilling. They turned everyone against you because they couldn't break you directly. You didn't bend. You didn't fall apart. You didn't give them the emotional collapse they were hoping for, and that terrified them. You were supposed to beg. You were supposed to explain, to defend, to unravel in front of them. But instead you stood still, calm, composed, silent, and that silence, it was louder than any reaction they expected. Because when someone can't break you directly, they try to dismantle the world around you. That's why they started speaking in whispers, planting doubts, twisting your name into a cautionary tale. They couldn't destroy you face to face, so they attacked you from behind. Not with fists, with influence, with manipulation, with calculated words spoken in quiet corners. They knew they couldn't confront your strength head on, so they used others, friends, family, mutual circles, as weapons to isolate you. They poisoned the soil so nothing around you could grow, because if they couldn't bring you down, they'd try to make sure no one stood with you. That's how cowards operate. They create distance between you and the world so that eventually you question yourself. They wanted you to feel alone, unwanted, discarded. But what they didn't understand is that you've walked through storms alone before. You've been familiar with silence, familiar with starting over. This wasn't new territory. It was just another version of the test you've already passed. You didn't need the crowd, you never did, but they did. They needed the crowd's validation to feel justified. They needed people to nod along with their version of events because deep down, They knew it was weak on its own. Lies always need company. Truth stands alone, and you kept your dignity. You didn't fight fire with fire. You didn't retaliate, and that's what drove them mad, because your restraint was power. Your refusal to stoop to their level was strength. And every attempt they made to break you only revealed how unshaken you truly are. They tried to exile you emotionally, socially, even spiritually, but all they did was expose themselves. One by one, the people they influenced will begin to see it. Not because you said a word, but because the truth has a way of rising when the dust settles. Your name will clear itself. Your character will shine through the fog. And those who were led away will remember who you really were, not the version they were sold, but the presence they once knew. And by then, the damage they tried to cause will only mark their legacy, not yours. Because you didn't fall, you didn't break. They turned everyone against you because they couldn't face you directly. And when someone fears your presence that much, it only proves one thing. You held more power than they were ever willing to admit.